2, 3. Ready. We're actually live already. Good day, everyone, or good night, good morning, depending on your time zone, obviously. So we're back today with another stream in the lighting discussion, lighting panel, whatever you want to call it. So today we are going to talk about Stylized PBR, which is interesting timing because I was having a couple of questions and conversation about it earlier before we decided to do it. So I think it's an interesting discussion. Is it different? Is it the same? Or is there something you need to keep in mind when you do Stylized PBR? Is there something in the authoring side? Is there something in the lighting side? These are some of the questions to figure out. There are a couple of articles online that kind of addresses it, but we'll be talking about it from a general perspective or overall perspective, technical perspective, lighting perspective, depending on what we discuss, I suppose. So let's first establish what we mean with stylized. So which one of you would like to take the round on that? What do you mean by stylized? Is it Blizzard type of style? Is it Telltale type of stylized? I suppose. What kind of stylized are we talking about? No,
I think that's
Torchlight.
like part of it, right? Is like defining like that. Like whenever like I've worked on something that's like they're like, let's do stylized. It's like, well, we have to define that first, and that's like always like an interesting challenge sometimes. Like I think like a lot of times, especially like art directors or something, they have something in their head, but like it's like something they've seen, but they're not sure, and it like, do we just copy that and something like when I worked at Riot, it was like more straightforward because it was like the stuff I was working on in like R&D was we wanted to make Arcane, but in real time. So it was like there was a target, but then I've worked on other games where they're like, we want to do stylized, but then it like they haven't clearly defined that before. And so they're like, you kind of end up in this thing where you're trying to define that with like on the fly, which is really hard.
Yeah.
It's like much easier to have like a target. But like it's interesting because I think like most games, even like realistic games, are doing something stylized a lot of times because like, you know, it's like film does that too. Like there's like the Hollywood look and like with color and color grade and lighting and stuff, and that's different than maybe what you'd see on TV in a drama, or there's just like this whole range of things. So it's like it's very contextual. That's like I'll give an answer by not giving an answer. Just start.
Well, how about you, Sora? What's your thought on it?
I'm still trying to wake up on a
Mm,
holiday long weekend morning. Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit last time too. It's like it's a broad umbrella, right? Like if you're talking about, are we talking about like texturing? Are we talking about lighting, materials or whatever? But like Nora said, it's it becomes a buzzword sometimes more than a specific direction, especially if you're not specific. Um, for me, like for example, stylized lighting can be something like, well, we break away or we exaggerate, PBR a bit by saying, okay, the indirect lighting is gonna be twice as much as how it would be in real world, like how it would react to PBR or whatever. Or we push the colors of lights beyond what you normally find or something like that. So I guess like a few good starting examples to begin with for me.
okay. I mean, when it comes to PBR, a lot of the questions asked and it's very varied what people are saying as well. For example, if you read some of the articles, people sometimes do breakdowns, right? And they're writing about PBR and they'll say they'll go beyond the PBR part of the stylization. So they'll tweak the metalness because it doesn't look stylized if they have the exact metalness they would normally do, or they'll tweak the roughness to make it look more stylized. What are you two thought on that approach? Because technically you're going away from PBR, arguably, and to maintain the stylized look of your workflow of your project. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Like when I've done like even really stylized stuff, like at my last job or like at Riot, And things like, to me, like, first off, like PBR is a system of rendering. So like it's not just like your values, like there's the systems that interconnect to each other and how they function. And like that's for me understanding those things and like directing teams like with those constraints. It's about using that system. I always start with, let's start at PBR, like correctness or within like normal ranges, because when you start, you have to like compensate for that when you make those changes across your entire project. So that's a new standard you have to set. You're like creating modulated PBR. You have to like, you can't just arbitrarily do that on a per asset basis or whatever. So it's like, let's start with PBR first and let's determine what the things we are want to change, whether it's like texturing, shading, lighting. Let's do experiments on each of those things and figure out what the changes are that's necessary. I try to like changing standards is like the last thing I have people do. If it, then we do it as like on whole, and we like a lot of times in like shaders and stuff, we'll cap where those ranges are or give feedback and like a PBR checker to like, here's where you should work. It's never good to just like ad hoc break PBR. You have to like do it with like intention and understanding of what the result is going to be. At least that's where I've kind of been when I've done that stuff.
Okay. What you sort of, do you want me to yell in your ear so you wake up a bit more, or are you good?
No, I'm good. I'm good. Uh, yeah, I think like that's a good point too, right? Like if you're trying to stylize something, but you're using a shader that's like meant for PBR, then you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot, right? Like Amit, like you were saying, like, oh, people want to make it stylized, they'll add some gray values in metallic, but in 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 reality, it's just using a PBR shader, so it's going to assume it's a PBR material, so it's not gonna look stylized. It's just gonna look broken
Yeah.
compared to a real material. I think like a good example is this article I was reading about Valorant and their characters. They actually, uh, I don't remember exactly, but I think like they have a character shader which sort of exaggerates the ambient lighting, um, sort of like coefficient. So basically, they started. The article's pretty good. I'm sure you can just Google for Valorant character tech art or something. Basically this is like, okay, we start with like what's a physically based render or shader, and then like they start adding layers of like Fresnel and exaggeration and just like ambient lighting exaggeration, because like as you know, Valorant is a stylized game, but at the same time they have like layers of PBR in the environment and stuff like that. So I think that's a way to go. Start with the ground foundation of PBR, then add layers to what our direction you're trying to hit.
It's a lot easier to make changes systemically downstream than change like the source. Right. So like, I mean, even in like State of Decay 3, we're like working right now to like define what our ranges are, to just like how does this work with our game and like all the things we're doing. Um and the main thing we're doing is like start PBR, and then if something has to change for visibility or something, and this is like a realistic game, quote unquote, but um, it's easier to do that into the shader to like modulate set stuff. Like instead of doing it on a texture level, we can do all that programmatically downstream. If we're like, because when you're changing something, you're not doing it on a per asset. If you're like all of our like, let's say like all of our metals, this is just arbitrary, like this idea, but let's say you had a situation where you're like, whatever's happening, all our metals are too hot and too bright. Like we kind of ran into this sometimes at Riot, when we were testing stuff, like they're too hot and then it just seems outside of like the style we're going for or something, or the opposite. Why don't we just author things correctly so the system works and everything works the way we expect, and then we'll change it in the shader to like boost that. Like from this, like if we get a lighting value, like if the material's brightness and the albedo is here to here, and we want them always to be brighter, let's just modulate that in the shader, so we're not doing that per asset. It's just easier to do there. not only because you're managing it in one place and you know it's like an overall thing, like all of our XYZ metals need this change. Let's just do that in the shader rather than have every artist go redo all their like brightness or darkness in textures, and then we have to keep track of that. That, oh, we did that to the textures. If we want to go back, we have to redo it again. It's easier to just, you know, input a value in a reference file or in the shader itself than to do that on a per asset basis. And then you know where the problems are too. Like when something breaks or it doesn't look the way you want, you're kind of editing everything in one place rather than on, like, you know, hundreds, thousands of assets potentially or something like that. But
Okay.
yeah, a lot of times I try to minimize the upstream changes from things and downstream adjust. Like where are we breaking PBR, where are we like doing something funky. So like for me it's like keep the math normal and like render everything and then change the render after you've like done the math of the lighting and stuff like that, depending again on what you're trying to do. If it's like overall values or something, that's one place to do it. But then there's like, you know, if we're like, oh, we want shading to be stylized, or like, yeah, like, do we want all the characters lighting, ambient lighting to be brighter than the environment and stuff like that? It's again, it's like understanding your systems and how PBR works, and then you target like with a scalpel the thing that will like help your change the most without breaking out the other things.
I think I'll show an image just to, because different people, they'll obviously do different things to achieve stylized look, and to show people also a little bit of visual example as well. Let's see, because some people, what they do, you know, they'll, when they kind of follow the roughness, it gets too roughness, they'll reduce the roughness to get the more stylized look, basically. So even though on the left side they have a more or less physically correct approach to it, according to them and what they figured out, they'll be going, it doesn't look stylized, and then they'll reduce the roughness. They'll do the similar things with metalness as well, to fake metalness or even remove it, depending on the dielectric properties and chrome properties of a material. And I see it quite a bit. People are ignoring certain properties, and then they'll say it's art direction. It's basically what they'll say. Um, so, what do you think about that? Is it art direction? Are we against it, or does it really matter if it looks good, or are we picky on it? What are you guys thought on that?
Um, I'll actually challenge the images a little bit, at least in the context of like how that's stylized. I think like especially the first one you showed. For me, like without having a context of what that surface is, right? Like I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, it's probably a tile, a floor tile or something, or a wall or whatever, because I don't have a complete context of what the surface is. To me, that looks like something in real world that's really polished and smooth versus something that's rough. That's not stylized to me. That's like that's like a real world value, and I wouldn't put the term stylized on that, right? But like for
um,
example, if you're doing stuff like texturing or like having painterly strokes on the base color or even roughness or whatever, then I think that's moving more towards stylized. Um, and the second one, the same thing. It's hard to tell without what material they're trying to hit, right? Like if the surface of that metal, so-called metal, is like something like oil rubbed metal or something, which is still a real world thing. But if you're trying to look at reference, you're trying to match that in your head, and if you're trying to use PBR for that, I don't think that's stylized, in my opinion.
Okay, so would
I think it
you?
depends. Like for me, a lot of times what you end up happening, or what I experience a lot, is art direction doesn't doesn't really understand what they're asking or what they're telling you to do. They're like, for me, it's like I want them to be less about the result. Like I want them to tell me like the thing sort of on a broad scale what they want, not a do this thing. Like instead of saying like what is stylized, it's like, well, what are like, are we talking like in this case we're talking about roughness on those image, like especially the first image, like what about this do you want the like the effect of it having on the viewer to be different? Not like tell me like make the roughness less rough or make the like what is it about this? Don't say stylize it more. Say like what do you want? Like so in one case it was like in the image on the left it was like it was less rough, and then the image on the right it was more rough. So like for them, instead of saying rough, what do you want? Like so do you want it shinier or less shiny? You know what I mean? Like boil it down to more art decisions, and then technical people can decide how to get there. And that's something I always have like an interesting time getting to, is because I think more they feel like they're supposed to tell you what to do rather than like what they want visually. And that's like something I push for. So like in terms of gloss in general, I think like what Sork said, like there's no PBR gloss really, like or roughness. Roughness is just a property of how you've weathered and like roughed up the surface. So anything can be super rough and anything can be super smooth. It's not, there's no like PBR to that. How like when we talk about what is we're using roughness, glossiness, and PBR, that's just saying how the math of like how like micros damage the surface is on average. But in terms of like, have you authored it correctly? The main things we're talking about in terms of like, did you do it right as an artist, or albedo, if we're talking about like, you know, metalness, roughness, pipeline, but which most people are. Is it the albedo in the right range? And then first thing is it metal or not? So you start with, is it metal or not? And then you have ranges of like typical, like where metal can exist in albedo, where non-metals exist in albedo. And then within that, when you have different types of surfaces, like a red brick, those will typically lie within certain hue and saturation values as well as their brightness or value. So roughness is kind of its own thing. It's like, well, what is the story of the material? And in that case, a lot of times it is just art. Like, what is happening with the art? Like, what is the story of like that this material went through in life to like end up where it is? So if it's like, you know, if it's polished, it's been like smoothed out, and if it's not, there's all this other stuff. But again, I think for me, it's like getting at the heart of like the effect, like the art side first, getting what they want from the art, and then we help them get to how to make it so it works. So it's context. It's always like, that's the thing about stylized, is like it's when you're not doing stylized, when you're like adhering to what you see in the real world, you can copy it really directly. It's much easier, I think, because you're not defining. It's just like you're drawing, figure drawing, versus like you are making a cartoon stylized figure. There's a point to where you are informed by the way things actually work. And you start there, and then you start stretching and squishing and modulating and to a point where it's like it's still recognizable, but you haven't gotten too far. But just like with anatomy, you can get to a point where you're just like a child drawing something and they're just like wobbly noodles of a person. And that's the same thing with rendering. Like it's finding that balance of like being informed by reality and then just tweaking specific things to get a specific effect. And that's hard. Yeah.
It's definitely interesting, especially considering you to kind of define the PBR, yet there is some open room for discussion. I think a lot of people consider stylized PBR anyway to be hand painted. So, for example, this image here, I'm taking images from people that have articles about PBR. I just don't
Yeah.
want to. I'm not mentioning their name or anything because I don't want them to necessarily to be targeted for whatever reason. So Sora was saying, you know, brushes, painting. So this person obviously spent time painting with hand, making sure it's, you know, has the nice curves and everything. The previous examples, the person didn't necessarily do that. They were more like texture using substance automation in some cases, like these, obviously, you know, arguably. So Are we saying stylized PBR or stylized texture materials primarily is considered stylized if it's handcrafted, or are we saying that it is considered stylized in even if it's used, automatically? Or what's the definition of stylized in terms of this topic? Because I don't necessarily consider it stylized if it's like towards this direction. Some people might consider this stylized, but it depends. Does it depend on how you made it to begin with? Is there a process that defines it to be stylized? Does that make sense?
I think when we talk about stylized, we're talking about visual style, right? So it's like the style isn't how you made it. Like we're working in a computer. From the beginning, you're not like making something hand done, even when you're painting it. Like to me, like stylized is like a modulation off of reality. Like you're not adhering to everything. Like you're not copying, reaching parity with reality. And then you're choosing what part you're going off of. Where are you like pulling away from that? Again, like I try to use like character is just something as a really like character art is a really good thing that is less like esoteric than lighting. So like, like is it if you Houdini built a character or you like hand sculpt a character or you polygon model a character, that's irrelevant. Or you scan something that you sculpted with clay. Like it's stylized not because it's the method used to do it, it's the output. So like like Pixar is stylized compared to like what live action, but then isn't Marvel and their colors and their lighting in the way like that's all stylized too with Marvel movies. Like, so there's like different, it's just like, again, it's like, what are we talking about? What thing do we want to stylize?
I
Is it
mean,
the sculpt? Is it the texture? Is it the form? Is it the shading? Is it the lighting? Is it the color grade? Like, there's all these things you can stylize. They're all deviations off of reality and how things work in your everyday life. That's stylized to me.
I mean, do you mind sharing the third image again? I think like it's easier to pick off the layers and talk
Yeah.
about it too.
yeah,
The sword one.
I'll
Yeah,
do
the sword. Yeah, the sword one.
I'll do a bit more, even more, because the chat is saying they want images in our discussion as it helps them. So I'm looking for a bit more.
I mean, I
Uh,
think the sword one was actually a good one. Like, that would be nice to just like pick up.
Yeah, because we can discuss what's stylized about this, right? Like it's concrete.
yeah,
Yeah, for me, looking at the sword thing, it was more of like the sculpting, the geometry itself, right? So if you look at something like that, you don't find a sword like that in real world. It's not practical, it doesn't make sense, and it's not realistic, right? So that's
Yeah.
like step one, like the shape language of that sword is like obviously exaggerated. It doesn't, it's not realistic. It's meant to hit a specific style. And then like, if you looked at the texturing of that thing, here we go. So I feel like obviously I can't see the different maps like albedo and roughness, but I can just look at the texturing on the wood itself on the handle, right? Um, and be like, well, that doesn't look like real wood, right? It's got like really exaggerated accents. It does resemble wood, but it's not realistic. It's missing the micro surface complexity that real world wood has, right? Um, same thing with like the blade and the shaping, and you can see the beveling on the geometry is like all very specific and done with intention. I think like in this specific piece, the modeling itself carries more of the stylized nature of it than the texturing, in my opinion. It's sort of hard to tell what their maps are doing, like especially metallic and roughness or whatever. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're actually PBR compliant, right? Like they're using the right metal value, the right albedo range, and stuff like that.
I would guess though, and this is a total guess, but I'm also looking at like the color inside of like the cracks and stuff in the wood. I bet they're painting those in.
Oh, you mean
Um,
like fake
they're
painting the
adding
ambient
they're
occlusion?
adding shadowing into the albedo,
Yeah,
and this is like where this always happens. It's like
yeah,
when they start doing stylized form and textures, a lot of times they start changing again. Like they're like, oh, but like my base color, like I did a brown that's like correct, but then they start like adding lighting information and shading, like like within the texture, they're adding shading to different things, and it's like they're doing that old method of stylized texturing. That is not how we want to do it unless we decide that, right? Like, so again, it's like, but people start with that. They'll make something stylized and it's like this beautiful thing. And then they by default, before we know that's like something you should do, they like basically paint in AO or cavity maps or even shading on the texture itself. They'll like add lighting and highlights and stuff into it. And we're kind of like, I don't know. There are definitely times again, it's like we need to decide that downstream because like one thing I'll have issues with is like people will do this sculpt and then they'll paint in lighting information and it's like, but I don't want I want an AO map first. Like I want to add that. I want to add an AO map. I want to be able to make sure like the lighting adds that first because if you paint that in, that won't update correctly, right? Like you'll shine light on a like different side of it and it'll stay dark. And so like for me, it's like going back. Like we might find out as downstream that like, you know what, even with AO maps, even with crack lighting, even with all this stuff, we want those cracks to be much darker. And then I would be like, okay, we're gonna paint those in darker, but like we need to understand why. We're actually telling the math and the rendering to absorb more light. Which is fine, right? Because like if you think to like film, like in props, sometimes they do paint and lighting in the real world onto a prop to make it darker than what the lighting in the environment does. And that's the key is like, what is the final thing that you're going for? That how is the best way to get there? If we're talking about you're doing a prop and you're doing an image and it's never going to be used in a game, that could be the right way to do it is to just paint in that thing because you're making a piece of art and the final output is a flat image on a screen. It's a bitmap image. If you're doing this object in a video game and it's going to be moving in a different lighting situations, we might not want to do that. It's all about context, which piece you stylize, quote unquote, which piece you change, which piece you make decisions for. Um, when we're talking like if we're talking in the context of like artists in general and they want to work in an industry in a studio and work on a game, like you need to understand like that's not the way you should be doing it as a default when you're in that studio. Don't paint in those maps by default. Don't like shade lighting. Like we need to see it function again as it would work, and then we'll make decisions off of that. So there isn't a right and wrong way. It's contextual to what you're doing.
I think this person used different masks to paint.
Yeah, I saw they painted in the shadowing there. Like
And obviously it's fine if you're having a portfolio piece. More problematic if it's a very visible piece and the lighting changes direction and all that, obviously. But it's just to give people context as well, and also for you to see that he or she is doing it in a certain order, and obviously this is an article from somewhere else, naturally, that I'm trying to keep
so I
somewhat.
think in this case we can say they've stylized everything.
do they
Right? They've
have like map
stylized
views?
how if they've painted in lighting, they've actually stylized how people
Yeah,
are in this situation. They have chosen, and again, it's not good or bad. It's about understanding the effect of what you're doing. And in this situation, it works because they're making an image of it's an artwork, it's a piece of art, a 2D piece of art. So whatever gives them that result is fine. In this
so to challenge this conversation even further,
Well,
eh,
yeah, before we like dwell into this even more, I was gonna like I was gonna point out that all the pieces that you showed, and this
yeah,
happens in production all the time, and it's like one of and Nora would probably laugh at this. They're all in substance. they're all shown in Substance Designer or Marmoset or whatever, and they're not in Engine. And like this has
Yep.
been this problem, and no shade to any artists out there, but like they make something in Substance, they look at it in like a part traced, really sweet renderer with a different tone mapper compared to Unreal or Unity or whatever, and then they throw it in an Unreal and it looks different in the context of production lighting,
Yep.
and they're like, "Oh, this is broken." Uh,
Yep.
because like Substance is made to look sweet. It's made to show off your assets, right?
Yep.
Um,
You don't
that's
have
a
to know how to render to make it look good in Substance. It's doing
yeah,
it
that's
for you in
which
the
is a
context of
problem.
what you're
Yeah,
doing, right? Exactly.
I've had
Substance is a like Substance rendering out stuff is a showcase for your work.
So this
So
was done
like,
in ZBrush, Maya, and Painter, Substance Painter.
is it
Um,
rendered in Painter? I'm guessing these images. Well,
Let me look at the
probably.
breakdown. Probably based on the fact that it's a breakdown. Texture requires pay attention. Texturized stylus as this requires paying attention to edges, variation, gradient, color, and roughness. The reason I'm picking this is not to put anyone down, it's because they are specifically saying it's stylized and PBR, and it's a good opportunity for us to talk about it and see what we think about it, and also to, for people are more informed about the challenges that might come when it's actually in the production setting versus when you're just making it for portfolio.
I think the other hard part that like we're at this stage that's challenging because like a prop artist, an environment artist, a character artist, it's not their job to understand how to render something right. And so like if they're putting in their portfolio something, they throw it in Unreal, it's gonna look like shit, right? Like so like when they're doing portfolio work, I would absolutely expect them to be doing this out of Substance. And what the
Yeah.
problem I think where the lack of sort of not even that, it's more of like a miscommunication, and I think this is our fault in sort of like a production situation is you have to be very like sort of not dogmatic, but like very diligent in explaining like what you're doing for your portfolio is not what you're going to be doing in the way you work and what's important in the studio.
Yeah, I think it's very common. Again, I think we have briefly mentioned it a few times, but not really discussed it in detail. Maybe it should be a topic in its own, but it is the fact that when you are working in a company, freelancing, outsourcing, and there is other people involved, they're so used to working on their own in their
Yeah.
tools, and then when us as lighting artists are then provided with assets that they think is correct or will function, you then find out it's not functional. There might be some issues. You go back, you try and address it, and it's back and forth. Now that's fine because we are at least on a senior level and above. We are quite informed about it, but that's not always the case. But it's also quite exhausting to always have your eyes open because you do have to have some expectation that the person who is a texture artist or material artist or a modeler that they eventually at least should know it, but the problem is they'll have to learn it on the job and they aren't really learning it before they join work. At least I haven't seen often the scenario where someone is straight out of a course or a school and they know exactly the possible scenarios because you don't learn that, unfortunately.
No.
Uh,
I I think like one of the thing I do want to add is like these pieces are beautiful. Like all of them look
Yes.
amazing, right?
Yeah.
Just want to acknowledge that, but also like I don't necessarily think artists need to understand how PBR works if they're not a lighting artist, right?
I agree.
and
Yeah.
and, and it's not their job to
Yep.
figure out why it looks different in Substance compared to Unreal. That's a job of a tech artist to help them understand. So the thing, so I've done like in current project and in the past is to bridge that gap. It's always been like a problem where like I can't look at it in production because my Substance is taking 32 gigs of my memory and I can't open the freaking map, and I'm like, you gotta do it, you gotta put it in production map. But also like we've done stuff like we have a PBR validation that Unreal uses, and I bring the same thing to Substance because Substance has great documentation for PBR validation, but their PBR validation has a lot of room for improvement, which is funny. So like you bring the same tool to like Substance, and then you're like, okay, the Unreal stone mapping versus Substance stone mapping is completely different, which makes a huge difference. And you're like, okay, can we try to bridge that? Try to mimic the same thing. And then you're like, okay, what about the part tracing they use? We're like, okay, Unreal also has part trace, so can we use the same cube maps to give them a library of cube maps? So there's ways to bridge this gap in the workflows that helps the artist like, all right, it looks 90% similar to what I'd expect, right? Because you're trying to match these complex layers.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, it makes
that's
sense.
100% agree. That's like that's the last 8 months I've been at Undead Lab has been like getting people set up for success. Like I'm not at a point even where I've built a few lighting tools, built a few things, but it's really about like I can't even begin to start doing the downstream stuff until I've made sure that everyone else is set up for success. And that was like, I built a completely like our own PBR checker that tells them, is it like if there's metal in the texture, like is it too high, is it too low? And that gives color feedback and a legend. And then that lets them, instead of having to understand that, it like shows you this is this is where your age is. Bring up your value, it's gonna go green. If it's not, it's gonna go purple. If it's not metal, it's gonna like have a different set of values and colors, and it tells you what to do. And then like we're building, like I'm gonna be taking that logic and building additional checkers for, again, it's like defining for them where their area to play in is. So like we've realized like a lot of our like vegetation, yeah, it's technically correct, but like in terms of the output we want like all of the saturation to be less and like the brightness all brighter. So I'm gonna have a vegetation checker that gives them within the ranges we want. And then we're building stuff into like the master shaders. Like a lot of our stuff, we're doing like grayscale for the textures. So like they don't need to see it. They're just doing form and shape and contrast. And then we colorize it in the shader. So in the shader, it's already going to keep them within a range. That is where it should be. So their output they're looking at is in our checking maps and in our like asset zoo and with our tools there. So it's like funneling where you're designing the look of your asset, you're safe. If it's looking good in here and it's telling you it's working, it's good. Because that's just a lot of work for every like an environment artist. We're not hiring them for that. We're hiring them to make really cool like art and make it look like trees or stylized trees or the texture, like the shape, like the shapes of how to texture and stuff like that. That's a huge deep skill set that to add more onto that is, it's just things are so complex. It's not really reasonable to have every artist understand every single thing in engines.
So certain games, Crash and Sane Trilogy, Ratchet and Clark, Monster University, some games that are stylized in PBR, and I'm gonna assume these are probably as well in some way or form in PBR.
Zelda's
So
not PBR. I'll tell you that right now. I know that for a fact.
so in terms of stylization, are we agreeing that these are all stylized games?
I'd
Or
say
Yeah,
so, yeah.
I think anybody like without us even defining it, there's an intuition that this is stylized. Every one of these, yeah.
so is cartoon stylized?
What is cartoon?
Cartoon, let's say
We have to
TV show
define that again,
cartoon.
right? Like, what
Let,
is a cartoon?
let's say you guys are making my job
If we're
easier.
talking about form, like the
You're like,
form
why are you
of
asking
things,
me
where
questions?
like in all of these, I think the thing we see immediately before we talk about anything else is shape language is not realistic,
All right. How about Peppa the Pig? Is
right?
that stylized?
In
Peppa
compared
the
to
Pig
a
is
real pig,
100% real.
yeah, we comparing to like a real pig, definitely stylized, yeah. I
Cool.
haven't
All
seen a
right.
pig like that at least in real world, so
So it's stylized, but it's not PBR, obviously, right?
The shape
clarifying.
language is stylized is the first thing that all of these have in common without digging into anything else. We have
So
stylized shape language.
it's 2D stylized, right?
Is 2D stylized? I
Like
mean,
this is 2D stylized, right? Because we're saying 2D and 3D doesn't matter. 2.5, it doesn't matter if it's stylized, it's stylized. It doesn't matter if it's 3D, 2D, 2.5. If it's stylized, it's
2D
stylized,
can be
right?
stylized, but if something's 2D, doesn't make it stylized. You could
Yeah.
paint a very realistic 2D painting.
I
That
think the point of this
yeah,
conversation is like you can't make a blanket statement that something is
yeah,
stylized or not stylized. Like I feel like we're going a bit of a loopy loop here. It's like look at the layers of it
yeah.
and what we talking about. Like break it down. Like there's so much some complexity in an image you're looking at. So I think like you have to put it on a magnifying glass as an artist and be like break down the layers, peel it out. I think that blanket statement is hard.
So, because we want to make sure people understand. So you have the stylization and then you have the PBR, two separate things, right? Because we had a video, we have had a video about PBR previously, which people can check out in detail as well. So you have stylization and you have PBR. So, what, according to your experience or your even knowledge, people you've talked to or heard and so on, would be a typical mistake that people do when they do stylized PBR versus non-stylized PBR, I suppose. For example, in my case, when I did SDS Vault, which is highly stylized, and it uses filtering technology on top, right, to filter the 3D artwork. So it's first textured in a certain way, and then it's filtered on top of it, which obviously also makes it difficult to light as well, because sometimes you will do the lighting before you see the filter on top, and then you have to look at it afterwards with the filter on top, and it kind of, you have a different look to it, and it pixelates the image sometimes, and you lose details and everything. Do you think that's the case when it comes to stylized images? You have to be aware of how it impacts the look of an object, because it's stylized, the lighting might not look the same, or you might have a different visual fidelity or quality to it. And I'm asking this because some of the articles I was reading and just double checking what other people were like saying in the articles from various of websites we all read, it was very mixed information, a very mixed opinion on what to do, what not to do when it comes to doing a stylization and things to keep in mind. From lighting to texturize, for example, one person was saying you have to pay attention to gradient and edge and variation when you're doing texturing for stylized assets, and another person was saying when you present your work, it's okay to use 3-point lighting, and then you have to do some post processing to kind of deal with something afterwards, and so on and so forth. So there was a quite a mix of advice out there. um, Gradient was very common though for stylized assets, um, global and localized gradient. So what are your thoughts on that? Is there something we should be aware of? Is there something that lighting artist should be aware of? Is there something we can explain to a texture artist or 3D artist that they have to be aware of this? I know, at least from my point of view, the most obvious one, just to give some idea of what I would have answered, is a lot of the stylized games or freelancing I've done, they're very saturated. So that does have an impact when I do my lighting, and the color might spread a bit around too much. Say it's a sunset and the scene is very wood oriented. This orange wood is highly saturated. I come with the sunset lighting. It's all quite often when you just do some basic stuff in the beginning, it's all orange, kind of easily very flat because it's just one color tone basically. Do you have any experience to that? Do you have any thoughts when it comes to these kind of scenarios?
Yeah, and I mean, I know you're trying to get at a one answer, but like this is part of the thing is it's not as humans we want solid answers, but life is contextual, and PBR and stylization is even more contextual. When we say realistic, we have this base off of like, okay, we do all these things, we're going to get this result. When you're doing stylization, you are going for a different result, and it depends on that result. Different styles require different things to happen, right? Like there's different ways. So you have to understand your style, and then that informs how you do it. In your case, if you're like, we want to saturate a game, but when I'm getting textures, it's oversaturated. Well, the solution is textures need to be desaturated. That's your specific situation, right? It's contextual to your game and your workflow. For you, it's hard to do what you're doing because the textures were too saturated. So in that case, you would tell your team, desaturate all your textures by like a certain amount. So again, there isn't a like, this is the answer. It is always about context. There isn't a right way to do it. It's about understanding the cause and effect and then informing that.
Sorry, people. There's no straight answers for you.
There isn't, and that's why there's so much back and forth, and people are trying to give definitive answers, and they turn it into like, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. It's contextual to what you're doing, and you have to understand how all of the things you are doing have an effect to do it effectively.
Yeah,
and that's the hard
like
part.
it's
That's why it's not an easy answer. It's like it's contextual.
it's difficult. Yeah, I know you're looking for it. This is what you define it as, but it's like again, I think the problem is the blanket statement, though.
Start
So
with PBR is like the easiest answer. Like again, like I always have our team start with being PBR compliant, and that gets us into where do we need to go from here, because we know we can start with something that we know how everything works, we know what the result will be, and then we look at that result together and we say, where are we, where's like the delta from where we are to where we want to be, and then we make those changes in the pipeline, whether it's in texturing, it's in shading, lighting. There's all these different places we can make decisions to move the specific type of stylization from where it is in reality to where we want to go. So why I say start with PBR is because you're not adding variables from the start. You only add variables and changes intentionally from when everything's working as expected. If you make a change before you see the result, a lot of times like you're gonna like be like, oh, well, which thing caused it, right? Like we can make things look more saturated in a ton of parts of the pipeline. Texturing, shading, color grading, lighting color. There's all these different places you can have that same effect. It's not about which one there's a right where place to do it. It's about understanding for your situation where the right place to do it is. And that's challenging.
so hypothetical situation, which is based on the scenario we kind of know happens. Um, Someone's doing their stylization. They're trying to do PBR, but they go off the PBR because it looks better. And it does happen that individually people do that. I've seen it in the bigger companies that one texture artist is doing something, and you don't really have time to check it in the bigger company. And specifically, I'm talking about Ubisoft.
Sorry, I'm gonna stop you just there. No, I don't want to interrupt, but before you move on, when you say it looks better, in the context of what? What do you mean it looks better?
Yeah.
What do you give me an example?
What do you mean? It looks better.
Because I
Like
would
their
disagree
asset
that
looks
breaking
better.
PBR rules generally
Where
look better. Yeah, like what are you talking about?
where was that decision where the asset was looked at and somebody said that looks better? And then who made that decision, and how does that looks better in that situation carry over to every other situation that asset could be in within the game?
Okay, let me give you an example of
That's too
this.
detailed question. That requires a very detailed answer. We don't want to get too into like this is the asset and this is the specific.
But like that again, it's context, right? Like you're saying, like should artists say, "Oh, I like it looks better, therefore I'm not going to comply to PBR." That's sort of your question, right?
Yeah, well, let's say someone's working on something and you don't really notice the difference. No one's noticing the difference because it looks the same, so more or less, right? Kind of. And
Then why
then
change it?
and
It's
well,
my question.
often it has something to do with skill level. I think people aren't necessarily aware of how to make it look like a certain way, so they'll use whatever they know to
Yeah,
achieve the look.
yeah,
And then oh, you do your lighting, and then suddenly you see, okay, I had
yeah,
this value. I know my lighting. I know it's correctly set up. I know it works in other environments. Why is this looking weird? Now, how would
yeah.
you deal with that, and how would you what can we do to make sure that there is a nice informative process of not turning down someone or you suck or something like that, but like how do you stop that from happening? Because this does happen
Oh, sure.
especially on DLC packages, because then it's like really quickly, and you assume people know everything, and then people are taking shortcuts, and then
Well, that's why you have a system for how this stuff gets checked in the first place. Like, you don't have a system where people are just authoring things and it ends up in the game. You have a process of approval, especially on large scale stuff, because you can't afford to do that. So, again, like, you give them ranges to work in, you give them tools that tell them that they have to use and check before something goes in the game. Their lead has to verify that it is goes through that whole checklist and like goes in the asset view and like turn on the checker. Is it flashing red or whatever? You know what I mean? Like stuff shouldn't end up in the game that's like that. If it does, then it's very easy to go, hey, here's what's going on. Here's where it's outside of ranges. That's a task in Jira. Update.
is that
It's
common though in your two example that there is always someone checking every material before it goes into the game?
I mean,
Because
that's the processes that I put in place. Like this is how it works. This is
right.
have
how
you
we're doing
guys
it. Like
have you guys seen
it
that? Sorry, have you seen that meme where it says you fuck around and you find out? You know what I'm talking about? Like that's basically what happens with PBR, and you can have a lot of guidelines, but people won't follow it, and then
yeah, and then
eventually it
it just
comes
has to
back.
be fixed. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's like because I've been in that world where in the past, like way when I was starting and then specifically wanted to do lighting and I was running the lighting and like I was the only lighter and like it was that world where everybody's just doing whatever and then I'm just redoing their materials because by the time like I have to like train everybody what to do and convince them it's the right thing to do. And like that's not a good place to be. And yes, of course, stuff is going to get through the net. Absolutely. But if you have this process in place, it's not a like, I'm just being a jerk and I'm just telling you to do something. You did it wrong. What's wrong? It's just, hey, you're like, it's just another task. It's just feedback. It's just, this needs to be changed. Here's why. Here's the checker. Here's the Jira. You know, ask either whether if you're working with someone directly, it's hey, here's what's going on. Can you just fix this, adjust this so we can like make everything work? And if they have a lead, it's just let their lead know. You know, hey, I see this material or whatever, this texture, it's out of range. Here's the map showing. Here's the checker. Can you get that adjusted? And it's like, yeah, okay.
All
You know,
right.
if you don't have those in place when you don't have a system, there's way more conflict because people are, it's not the way we're doing it. It's your art is bad. No matter how you give it to them, if you just explain like, hey, I'm having a hard time lighting this because they're like, well, I think it looks great.
Size question then. Do you think? Do you think? Do you both think that because a lot of lighting artists are coming out and they're having courses and mentorship and whatnot, they're not necessarily learning 3D or everything. Do you think that they at least should learn how to author PBR materials and learn the process of doing it, even though they are specializing at lighting artists?
Lighting is about rendering. So understanding ranges and like flat color. They should know how to like what those values are. Yeah. Because in the end, they're gonna get blamed for when it doesn't look right. For their own saving their own skin, you have to understand this stuff because you're like what's gonna happen is they're gonna end up in a situation where they are the only lighter or whatever because they're at some studio who doesn't understand how
Sounds like
complex lighting
sounds
is.
like my life.
Yeah, and nobody has this in place, and like the management is still working in PS3 era is their experience when they worked on stuff, and they're gonna end up as this junior person, and this happened to me, like a junior person who's the lighter, and people are gonna get their stuff in the game, and you've done your job correctly, and it looks like shit, and people are gonna why it doesn't look right. You're not lighting this correctly, and then you're gonna be like, well, uh I don't know. If you're like, "I don't know," then you're not doing your job. That's how everyone looks at it. If you don't know why, it becomes you did the lighting wrong. So you have to be able to give your position that, "No, here's where the change needs to happen, not this person fucked up their textures." It's, "This is how this system works, and these are not consistent with how the system works. They need to be changed." If you don't know that, all you're saying is I don't know how to do my job.
You don't want to suck as a lighting artist? Learn materials. There you heard it.
You have to understand how they work. You don't have to understand how to make substance make the shapes you need, right? Like cool, but not your job necessarily. Um, but you have to understand how all the rendering works. Like you do.
So let's try and punch through at least a couple of punch through a little bit, at least some of the comments. There's a question though from Perry, which I don't really understand, but we're gonna twist it around until we make sense of it. So, in your experience, has there been anything you mostly want to keep from PBR and never push past? Do you guys understand the question or no? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, like I always try to start with keeping like off your materials that are like PBR compliant in standards that are common. Let's start there. And that is the last thing I change. If I change like, oh, snow is 0.98, like I don't do that until it becomes apparent. I've had some experiences where I know certain things, like people like tend to always go to white or like when it's like, well, it's a non-metal, like there's stuff where like I might build in some like constraints because I just know how the team behaves. But I try to keep PBR in terms of like value, like how value works, like how bright is the texture, and like if it's a non-metal metal, I try to keep that as long as possible because again, it's easier to change. Like we want some things, like we want it more saturated, we want everything to be brighter. I can change that in every other thing downstream, and I'm doing it across the board, or I'm targeting something very specific rather than in the source. So for me, it's like and I think it's easier for artists to have that consistency. Like, hey, this is how we're authoring our textures, and it's how things work in the real world. Check it in like an environment that looks like real. Does it look real? Move on, kind of thing for me. So for me, it's like I try to keep the authoring of the textures consistent. We can stylize the values and saturations and colors downstream. That's my like one thing where I start with at least. Yeah.
Do you have anything, Saurabh?
I think it's again goes back to context. So let's just say that you're making a Call of Duty game, or maybe you're making Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the latest one, I guess, because I think some Call of Duty is stylized. So I guess I'm guessing that one of their pillars is photorealism, because they use photo scans and everything looks pretty photorealistic. So if you're like, okay, in this project, an artist is making a gunmetal from for this gun that exists in real world, and most of the gunmetals tend to be like anodized or weird, layered on a gun metal or whatever. So like if you're making something in the real world and you're like, okay, what's this reference? What is this surface? And then it's like it's stainless steel. Okay, you got pretty straightforward values for that. Put that in your engine if it's whatever PBR material workflow you guys are using, and then now it's like, okay, this is what the real value should be. You don't move past from that. You have no reason to do it, especially in that project, because one of your pillars in art style is photorealism. Why are you budging from that? So if someone comes back and like, oh, I changed it because I'm actually not trying to mimic stainless steel. I'm trying to mimic this anodized metal. I'm like, okay, well then the problem is you're trying to create some other material that's not what you're hitting right now, right? So that's sort of an example where you shouldn't be breaking rules, especially when you're art direction dictates it.
It's interesting. So, do you to consider it correct PBR even in the context of stylization? And let's say you're lighting it, and you increase the indirect lighting, like you're doing something extra to make it look the way you want to look. Is that because there's something wrong with the PBR setting and the materials and the values and the saturation, or is it just because you chose to do it because your lighting is setup is wrong? Is there anything for you to where it states that one or the other is incorrect? Is it the material? Is it the lighting? Or it doesn't really matter if you know for a fact that it is more or less correct, the PBR, but you just want things to look
Hmm.
a bit brighter?
Yeah, I mean, it's layers of onions, right? Like the peeling part that I keep talking about. Let's just assume that in your context, in your example, this is Call of Duty again, right? Photorealism, and you put a material in there and it looks awful. It looks like something's absolutely wrong. Now you have to go through your checklist, start from the bottom, look at the materials, right? Maybe they have I don't know, they have AO accidentally baked into the base color, maybe, right? And then you're going through your validation, you're going through the checklist, and you're like, oh wait, here's your problem, and then give it back, they fix it, comes back, still looks like shit, right? In
That
the map.
actually happened to one of the projects I did, and I didn't
Yeah,
know that part until like this is some time ago. It took me 4 months to figure that out. That's just
yeah. So you go.
thing.
We went through the first checklist and like, okay, the materials are in range. They look fine. Your map's okay. And now you go to the next set of checklists. You're like, okay, in this specific map, this looks broken. Then go through your lighting parts, right? You're like, okay, what's my, is something broken with reflection? Something broken with diffuse lighting, indirect lighting? Maybe if it's a probe leaking issue. I don't know. There's like 20 different things that can be wrong, right? So you go through each layer and then you like, sort of like target what's the problem. Because otherwise, it's going to be looking at a needle in a haystack. And it often is if you don't go to the fundamentals and check one thing after the other.
Which is why I like textures, like why I want us like a solid like standards at the texture level, because I want the problem to be my fault, right? Like that narrows down what isn't looking right to you and to what you're doing and to the situation where you're looking at something. You know that, it's much easier when it's you've isolated that. And then if the change needs to happen, it's you rather than in all the textures. But you do have to do the checklist first, like double check, make sure, like go through your checkers and be like, okay, where is it going to? Okay, good. Now I know it's me. And that's a situation where, you know, where yeah, you might realize like you're in a forest and um yeah, the end like it is correct, right? Like you've done it correctly. This is how light actually works. The materials are working correctly, but it's too dark. Then you need to decide like, do we change camera exposure? But like then the whole image is brightening. We want it actually to be the indirect bounce so that not, everything is brighter, just like indirect lighting. And you start making decisions of that's where you're stylizing the lighting. It's like what piece of lighting that gives the result of brighter indirect do I want to do? What's the best thing to do to get that result? Is it just increase GI, which I try to almost never do? Are you adding in like fill lighting that bounces more light into the space? Are you, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Are we going into the shader and we're finding the direct light direction and then adding more? Are we then boosting that after it finds that into the opposite direction to increase the albedo to make it look brighter? Like there's all these like weird things. Like there's a lot of decision you make at like what kind of complexity am I doing? What's the simplest solution that achieves the result I want? There isn't just a do this to get the result. It's contextual. It
I think
depends
that's
on what tools you have, what engine you're using, what type of like are you deferred, forward, all ray trace. Like there's all this stuff. Yeah.
I think that's a good topic for next time. Like
Yeah.
prep. What would the topic name be? It will be, I don't know,
Go through
establishing
the
a good
checklist,
pipeline or something. Like
not a workful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very useful, especially because I am doing it right
And
Uh,
also, like, one more thing I wanted to add is like, it's really, if you're a lighting artist, you're probably not a lead or a tech artist. None of this is actually on you, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like, don't be overwhelmed with all of these. Like,
Go get
what the
help.
fuck is
Yeah.
happening? Yeah,
It's okay to get help. Like I wish
because like
more
it's
people would do that.
honestly a lead lighting artist or a technical artist who's like, it's their job to aid you in this
Yeah.
process. Like, that's what validation tools and just pipeline stuff
don't
Yeah.
is
listen to
all
these two.
for.
You have to learn the skills before you get the
Don't-
role. You stay a step ahead all the time.
or maybe hire a technical lighting artist, not towards the end of the project. you
Just
know
Which is
message
where it
or
happens. Yeah.
ask questions to both of these two. No problem.
For a lighter that like you're starting, the most important things are like again, like you understand how the light works. You understand how like Unreal's various lighting stuff, vanilla out of the box works. You understand texture values, how those like how the standards are, and you are good at art. Um, are these other things important and useful? Yeah, but like that's way too much to again like out of school asking somebody to like understand shading and blueprinting and code and like script like all this like that's a lot. That's like you start going towards that specialization as time goes on. But the way you learn how to do those things is understanding the basics. Like that's how I make decisions, even if I'm building something that's like some blueprint tool or some shading thing that does something, I have to understand the basics of why the thing happens, why it looks the way it does. And that's everyone needs to understand that who's doing lighting.
Makes sense. All right, we're nearing the end. If you made it this far, congratulations! You get to like and subscribe and leave a positive comment if you made it this far. Also, this coming Wednesday, we have a portfolio review. We're teaming up with Dynasty Empire to do a portfolio review. So post it on Discord and we can review your portfolio. And then a week after or 2 weeks after, we have the Game Dev Roundtable. We haven't picked the topic, so leave some comments to let us know what topic. That is the EU time zone, and we cover other things that's not necessarily lighting oriented. So things going on during the summer anyway. So it's all good. Um, the Unreal Lighting course is technically free. So head over to lightingbot.com. The first part, the most important part, where we go through materials, which is kind of what we're talking about, is completely free. So, have a look, have a watch, learn these things. Completely free. Did I say that? Yeah. So that's all good. And yeah, thank you to Nora and Soro as usual to be able to show up today and to talk about. I think some of these topics are quite complicated to a lot of people. To be fair,
Spicy.
yeah, because we all learn general stuff when we start
Mhm.
out. It's a lot to deep dive into basically. Um, and yeah, and for the rest of you, Vasil, Daniel, Parry, Elliot, I know you guys were watching, so thank you for watching as well. Leave a like, don't be a ninja watcher. Be nice to us. All right, we'll end the stream. I'll talk a little bit more with Nora and Sorob as usual before I send them out today morning, their morning day. And yeah, thank you again. See you guys around. Thank you for watching.